Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Lit Service, where we're fans of fiction and purveyors of dodgy writing advice. Today, for introductions, we're going to do favorite conundrums. And so my favorite conundrum, I'm Aaliyah, my favorite conundrum is if you're falling to your death in a fiery elevator, do you listen to Hello Darkness My Old Friend by Desperation or the Kung Fu Panda soundtrack?
Okay, well, I'm Cameron, and I have a lot of trouble deciding between skeletons and zombies as minions.
I'm Kristen, and my favorite conundrum is trying to decide if I would rather have legs the length of fingers or fingers the length of legs.
Think about that for a second. Well, we actually discussed this at length before we started.
We did, and I think my vote is legs the length of fingers, but...
Can you just admit? Okay. Anyway. My name is Caitlin, and I've been wondering if I would rather have a beak for a face, or whether I would rather have no mouth to talk at all.
Wow.
Hey, my name is Ben, and my current conundrum is if I should buy my son a Christmas present in New Jersey, or if I should buy my son a Christmas present in Utah when I fly out to Utah for Christmas. So that's my current one.
Big
one. It's a good one.
Yeah, that's a real life conundrum.
I don't know, Kristen's. It could be.
It could be. You don't know. You can't prove it's not.
I also put this piece of paper down because I'm fiddling with it, and it looks like I'm like.
I thought you were knitting.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kathryn.
Hey, I'm Kathryn Purdie, and I'm thinking of my last minute on the spot conundrum because I missed that. So this is what I've got. Would you rather go to sleep at 4 o'clock? No. I'm making up another on the spot. Would you rather
She froze.
Oh, no.
2 weeks straight?
Oh, try one more time, Kathryn. You froze.
Assuming you can stay alive. It's dumb. I'm tired.
That's
Wait,
okay.
you
We
have to
did
say
not
it all
hear
again.
anything that you said, so you can start
Shut
over
up.
again.
Okay. Oh, I hope my connection is good for us today. Would you rather walk for 2 weeks in the rain or not shower for 2 weeks?
That's a good one.
Ooh, that's really good.
There you go.
Okay, well, as you've probably noticed, this week we have some special guests. We have recurring contributor Ben Grange, who is an agent at the L. Perkins Literary Agency. And we have #1 New York Times bestseller Kathryn Purdie, author of Burning Glass, Crystal Blade, and Frozen Rain. So thank you so much for coming. We're glad to have you. Today, we have a fun discussion on crucibles, particularly how to build a crucible for your characters and put it into your story. So let's just start with the general question. What is a crucible both generally and in the context of this discussion? Kathryn, since this is your favorite thing in the world, do you want to answer that? What's a crucible? Or a crucible?
A crucible, if you want to talk about it in a chemistry reference, it's a vessel which different ingredients are melded together in white hot heat. So you can put like various metals together and they'd melt together and make like a new alloy or something. So for writing, it's a container that holds characters together as things heat up. So it can be a closed environment, like you're stuck in an elevator, that's a trope, so, or like The Breakfast Club, that movie where they're all stuck in detention. Or it can be an emotional environment, like if you want to think of Star Wars, like Luke, Leia, Darth Vader, they're a family that can't escape each other.
Awesome. There are a couple of different kinds of crucibles too. There can be a physical one, like you were talking about, where you're stuck physically in an area. I just watched an episode of Doctor Who where they're stuck like in this alien bus and can't go outside because the sunlight will kill them. There's also emotional crucibles, like you're talking about with a family. And then there's also social ones, like in the office, where Pam and Jim stay working at that office because they're friends / wish they were more than friends, even though it's horrible.
Yes. So love is a crucible for sure, because you can't just snap your fingers and decide you're out of love with somebody, and love can cause you to do crazy things like continue to work in that office.
Yeah, I think the important thing about a crucible is that your character's motivation to stay in it has to be bigger than their motivation to run away from it. So like I'm trying to think about, okay, one of my favorite series, The Queen's Thief. The King of Atolia is such a good example of this, because you have a main character who does not want to be king, but he loves his wife so much that he ends up staying there and being really good at what he does, even though he easily could leave if he wanted to. And so the tension, I guess, between what he wants and what he wants more is what makes a really cool crucible.
Exactly. And like going back to Star Wars, yes, you're a family, and you can't just, again, like snap your fingers and say, I'm not going to be a part of this family. You could, but your story would probably end there, because that's the thing that's creating the tension. And there would be a lot of steps to actually distance yourself from a family. But Luke and Vader, like one, they both want the other to turn to the light or to the dark. And that's what keeps them together. Beyond the family, it's that, like, that moral urge that they both feel is the right thing, and they're desperate because they're family to get the other to change sides. And when the crucible ends, the story's over. When Vader dies and one of them switches over, the story's over. That's usually a crucible-focused story. That's when the story ends, when the crucible ends, whether they fix their problems within it or whether they fix their problems by breaking out of the crucible.
Well, and part of a crucible, like scientifically speaking, is that you put two things together, and through like whatever process, you create something new. And so I think that's true of characters as well. You either create something new or you break it.
Yes.
That's a really good point. Kind of transitions to our next question. How is a crucible different from any other kind of climax?
I don't know if I really think about it in terms of being a climax, other than that when the characters fix their problems, that's when it ends, or when they escape the situation, and that's when it ends. And not every story has to have a crucible, and you can even think of it as scene centric rather than like entire plot centric. So I don't know if you guys have more thoughts on that, but I don't really think of it that way, but maybe you guys have, because it's part of our discussion. Like how do you think it's different?
Maybe rephrase the question.
I mean, personally, yeah. I mean, when I first heard this question, the thought that popped into my mind was that a climax is a moment in your story, but a crucible is more of a process. So we've talked about a whole bunch of different stories, Star Wars being one of them, and the crucible in this story is not just the ending when, like Kathryn was saying, that Luke defeats the dark side and Vader dies and everything is happy again. It's the entire process up to that moment that brings them together to the climax. So it's not necessarily a climax, but more of something that can get you there. And I think this is a kind of good time to bring this up, that one of the hardest parts about writing a book is your middle.
Yeah.
And not knowing what to stick in the middle of your book, because you know your climax, you know your beginning, you know your inciting incident, but figuring out how to get to that climax is such a hard thing to do. And so if you stick your characters into these crucibles of love, of social pressure, of emotional conflict, those are the things that can drive your story forward in the middle and provide good, fulfilling story for your reader to pull them along to that moment of the climax when the story will be close to finish.
Yeah, exactly. So I think of a crucible more as like a tool for tension.
Yeah.
So your stories might not have them, but can you add one to your story? It's going to add so much tension, and it's going to fill up that middle space, not with just fluff, but with internal and sometimes external forces if it's a closed environment, but forces that are going to add tension so that the stakes are that much higher when they do get to the climax and are trying to figure out how to fix their story problem.
I think an example of what you guys are talking about is the Hunger Games, because you have an artificial, like the Hunger Games arena is a crucible. It forces the characters all together, and through the whole thing, we know only one character can survive, and so the tension is building and building, building. That Katniss and Peeta, I mean, one of them's going to have to kill the other one. That's a crucible. I mean, I don't know if that's the only way you could frame that particular crucible, but it adds tension as we go because we know like that we're going to get down to that point, and so it like rockets people into the climax of the book, and it with like a big flare rather than creeping into it, I guess.
Yes, and it's the best when you can. I mean, any kind of crucible you can add is going to add so much for your story, but when you can add both and even just for a scene, that's like when characters should have objective and they're external. So it's just gonna. What's going on over there? What are you guys laughing about?
Kristen had to leave, and she just crawled under all of our cords. And it was really but actually, you froze for a second. Could you restate what you just said?
Oh dear.
Sorry.
I was saying that the very best thing I think you can do, and it's not always going to be possible, but whenever you can combine a physical crucible with an emotional crucible, it's double your bang for your tension. And that's also why the Hunger Games work so well, because you've got the closed environment of the arena, but then you have the crucible of love. Whether or not Katniss even really believes she's in love or can trust it, there's still that relationship, whatever you want to call it, with Peeta, whether it's romantic or whatever, they feel she comes to trust him, and that's a crucible. And then her, all of her moral, like the duty she feels to do the right thing, which is why she entered the arena in the first place, is to protect her sister, and then the injustice of the world she lives in. Those are all things that drive the physical motivation of winning that game. And
we've lost Kathryn.
I mean, it was a really good point.
She must have gotten shot down in the Hunger Games. We lost the tail end of it, but I think we got your point. Actually, what you were talking about is one of my favorite parts of the Hunger Games is that Katniss's crucible isn't necessarily that she's in love with Peeta, but that she has to pretend that she is in order to protect her family. And so it's so important for her to pretend that she's in love with Peeta when she really isn't, and has to that's a fun one, actually. And Cameron, I think you were.
I mean, so I was thinking of there's Red Rising has a lot of parallels to that same crucible. So in particular, I was going to say there's one scene. So there's massive spoilers for any of this.
So if you haven't read Red Rising and want to, stop listening.
There's an emotion. There's a really great emotional and physical dual crucible going on, where just a brief amount of setup for those who aren't familiar, so you can get what's going on in this scene. So the main character Darrow is attempting to infiltrate the elite of society so he can free his people. Now, in order to do that, he has to get past this test where he's thrown into a room where he either kills the other applicant in the room or the other applicant's going to kill him. And it has dual crucibles going on. Because on the one hand, there's his own sense of justice and morality weighed against, well, if he fails here, he can't free his people. Also, complemented with the very physical crucible of it's him or me. Like, it's regardless of what I decide, he is going to attack me, and I have to react to that. So it's yeah.
That's an excellent example. I really like that. So how do you incorporate crucibles into a story?
Kathryn, you had some really great points about this. Kathryn teaches classes about this, and so we're just picking her brain.
There's lots of ways you can do a great doing it through secret. It can be a coworker. You can't escape a coworker. Like going back to the Office example, you've got Love, which is nice for Jim and Pam once they figure it out. But he's also, stuck with Dwight. So there's, anytime. So the crucible is a professional dude can't quit his job so easily. You can think about like marriage is a crucible. You can't just so easily escape a marriage, and Jane Eyre is a great example of that. So you think about your characters' professions, their relationships. If there's not enough interesting things going on, then there can be a secret relationship you didn't know about that before. And Star Wars is fabulous with that, of course, because we don't know that Luke and Vader are related in the beginning. And that's something that they carry on throughout the whole series as they do prequels and additional sequels and things, is that there's always like a deeper, the family relationships are always getting extended. That's like at the core. It's like a continuous crucible, even though Vader dies. Before he died, his love. I don't know. So just thinking about their professions, their relationships, as far as emotional ones go, and physical closed environments, you're not always going to have those in every story, but maybe like you've got a scene that's not so interesting. Maybe if they're stuck in a rainstorm together, it's more interesting. You know, just something like that that's gonna help raise the tension a bit.
Maybe a way to think of it more generally is that if you can limit the available choices, that's a way to increase tension.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think specifically because I've talked about on this podcast before, but I mean, the entire crux of your story needs to revolve around your characters making decisions. And if your characters aren't making decisions, then nothing's happening. And if you can limit the number of decisions that your characters can make, that will infinitely increase the tension that your characters are experiencing, and therefore that your readers are vicariously experiencing in your book.
One of my favorite crucibles is between Aang and Zuko in The Last Airbender, which we talk about that. I feel like it's Harry Potter and Avatar: The Last Airbender in like every episode.
I'm okay with that. That's
yes,
probably driven by me, but
I think their crucible is really fun because it goes so deep. Because Zuko has to capture Aang in order to be readmitted into his own family. And Aang can't let himself be captured, but can't hurt Zuko either because he's the Avatar. And so they're like, well, Zuko's continually chasing him all over the place. Sorry, that's just another random example. But
yeah. No, go ahead.
And then that particular one mutates because eventually they end up on the same side. But Zuko's father is still his father. But his father is still a genocidal maniac, and also and Aang is friends with Zuko, so that makes the situation more complicated, combined with the fact that he's actually a pacifist and doesn't want to kill anyone. So you get a whole bunch of irreconcilable motives and goals, and it makes the whole thing really tense.
Cross purpose.
Yeah, and can you guys hear me? Kind of froze.
Yes.
Mostly.
There we go. Anytime you can think of that your characters need each other, that's a good indication that you've got a crucible in the works. And if you can recognize that, you can milk it for all it's worth. Like another example is like going to school together, right? There's a reason why school stories are so popular. And for me, like Harry Potter, whenever they get to Hogwarts, the story just instantly gets like 20 times more interesting, not just because Hogwarts is a really cool place. It's a really cool place, you know, so motivate each other within that place. So what?
We lost you when you said it was a really cool place.
Oh dear, I'm so sorry. Yeah, basically it's a really cool place, but they're also stuck in that really cool place. So, you know, for me, here, but the last how they got to Hogwarts, even though they did have some crucible situations on the way, but there's just something really magical about a school setting. And when you have a fantastic or really interesting school, or if your closed environment can be really fascinating, like the arena in the Hunger Games or Hogwarts, then that's a fantastic closed environment crucible.
We've got about a minute left. Does anyone have any final thoughts on the subject before we transition over?
I just want to say this is probably one of the most important podcasts that I've participated in since I started regularly joining. I mean, just because the Crucible the character crucible dynamic that we've been talking about is such an important aspect of your book. It doesn't have to be a stark, like, noticeable crucible like we've been talking about with Katniss or with Star Wars. Like, it's just anything that your character emotionally has to grapple with inside themselves, and they come out either better or worse in the end. And if you can incorporate dozens of tiny crucibles throughout your story, or just one large crucible, or any number of them, your story is going to be all the better for that, because they add so much tension. And I can't think of a better topic to discuss with especially beginning writers who are struggling getting their ideas onto the page, struggling figuring out how to get from beginning to end. This is such an important part of the process that if you start to frame it in your head as, this is a process, this is a crucible, this is what my characters are going to go through in the story, then you can start to map those things and you can start to really write them. And it's something that took me years and years to learn as a beginning writer. So any beginning writers listening, watching this podcast, however you watch or listen, this is probably one of the most important ones that you can listen to.
I think
I've learned.
Sorry, go ahead. Okay. I think that it makes the difference between having a character-driven story and a plot-driven story a lot of times. Because if you have things that you want to happen, a lot of times if you put your characters in a crucible to make it happen, then it makes a whole lot more sense.
Excellent points.
Amen.
All right. Well, now we get to kind of take some of that crucible knowledge and apply it to a writing group scenario for the submission. So this week, the submission was about Henry, the son of a presidential candidate. He is walking home from school when he almost gets kidnapped. To the surprise of everyone, he discovers he has some sort of superpower and that he can't tell anybody about it. So what did we like about the submission?
I thought in general it was pretty easy to follow, clean writing, good grammar. Like I wasn't really pausing a lot to struggle like what was going on, and it flowed well. I liked the little bits of humor when they were there.
I love the first line. It says, "It started with tacos. Doesn't it always?" I thought that was so funny.
Honestly, I thought that was a pretty good first line. I liked that one a lot. It really kind of gripped you in the author's head for a moment.
Then
Yeah.
stamp of approval.
Yeah, I don't normally give it for first lines, so.
I really liked that the character is really proactive. I mean, he isn't necessarily at the very beginning, but once we get into where he walks home and then there's an attempted kidnapping, he doesn't just like...
He doesn't stand there and take it.
Yeah, he like throws his backpack into the kidnapper and he fights. And he, is self-described as like the pudgy little kid who can't pick up weights in the gym. And so he's not willing. Like, I really liked watching him as a character like come to life right there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the author did a really good job with starting the book with an action scene, and I think specifically what I struggle with a lot with submissions is that authors will take the advice to start with action and like immediately jump into an action scene that we are not grounded in and that doesn't make any sense at all. This, however, did it really well in the fact that the author took time to explain things and grounded us in these characters and their backgrounds before the action happened. So it wasn't a boring first chapter, but it also didn't just slam the action right in my face from the first paragraph. So I thought that was really well done.
It was a cool angle too, the kid of a presidential candidate. And I thought there were some really nice lines in here, like it describes terror like shrapnel through his body, and just some nice descriptions when he gets his superpower.
I really liked the line that said, orange and red streaked across the sky, and the air smelled like football and sweaters. That was a perfect fall sentence right there.
If we're okay to move on to things that might need a second look, while I did love the first line, when tacos weren't brought up again until much farther down the page, it became a little confusing for me.
I agree with that. I think after the first line, everything can be basically cut until you get to the asterisk in the middle of the second page, because it's a bunch of dialogue that is just back and forth, and it doesn't really move the story along. It kind of broke up the pacing, and it doesn't really add to anything. I would just start with, it started with tacos, doesn't it always? And then go into what the tacos are precursing.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot of grounding details, but it takes too long to get all of it across for what it's doing.
Yeah. My big issue with it, with that first page, is that Lucy was the one that seemed to be.
We're losing you.
She's the one, and Tom wasn't very to introduce her to a boy. But we don't really understand what Henry's internal problem is until after the asterisk. And that's the real hook, is that he's the president's son, right? That's kind of, to me, the main internal hook of the story. So, and I want to be shown it rather than told it. So I would love for it to start with, so the, you know, it's after school, the dark sedan can pull up and try to pick him up. And he's like embarrassed, and we see how it feels to have, you know, security detail come try to pick you up at your school. And I needed a little bit more grounding personally into the setting, like is he in a private school, because he's the potential president's son. I needed a little bit more setting grounding. But I think in general, I wanted to be shown a little bit more of his internal problems. It could happen quickly. We can still get in. Just
We lost you again, Kathryn.
being told what it was like to be the president gets attacked.
It feels like we spend a lot of time talking about the wrong details.
Mm-hmm.
It's not bad that we get them, but we don't need them yet. We have the whole bit with he knows, like, it's cool that we know that he knows Spanish and that he's going to this after school club thing, but all of that only exists to tell us why he's leaving school later than everyone else. And just for that much that's literally all we needed to know for the action sequence to start. Mm-hmm. So we still want like the character, like what character development we get. But I realize some of this is going to sound very contradictory, but if you can do the same amount of character building in a much smaller space and get to the action sequence quicker.
Yeah, I think one of the big problems I felt was that you get 2 or 3 pages in, and the biggest problem that this character has faced so far, up to this point, is whether or not his dad will become the president, which is not at all that compelling for a teen reader. To read about a kid whose main concern 3 pages in is my dad going to be the president or not? We definitely want to get to the, am I going to be kidnapped or not? A lot quicker. It doesn't mean that the kidnapping has to take place on page 1, but maybe ground us a little bit more in, you know, my mom said I might get kidnapped, or my mom said I might get attacked, or my mom said I might be in danger, a little bit earlier, so that you can ground us and just not have the sole problem that he faces for several pages be his dad's problem.
And also, we never even know how he feels about, if we don't know if he wants his dad to become president or not.
Yeah, that's really brought up.
There's not a connection there between, like, is he embarrassed? Is he happy? Like, how does it affect him personally? How is the stakes for him?
There's a couple sentences that talk about how he's not happy about having to choose between staying here and going away if his dad wins. But it is later, and I feel like there are a lot of relatable concerns that you could focus on with the situation of my dad is going to become president. But like the most prescient one, well, I'm a target for kidnappers now, he brushes off. So there's a dramatic irony in that reading that, like, he's totally about to get kidnapped, but there's no emotional tension from him because his only concern, to me, like, the only concern he raises is, I don't know if I want to live in DC. It only gets a sentence.
I feel like by the end of the first chapter, especially with middle grade, we should probably, maybe not the end of the first chapter, but close to it, we should know what our character wants and like why they want it. And by the end of this first chapter, I felt like I knew he thought he was chubby and that he had superpowers and couldn't tell anyone about it, but I wasn't really sure why it would matter to him that he had superpowers other than it being cool, or like why that, I don't know. Like it seems like I didn't know a whole lot more about him than I did at the beginning of the chapter.
We're out of time, but does anyone have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Go ahead, Ben.
Sorry, I was just going to say a couple more things. I feel like a lot of the writing in this passage was a little underdeveloped. The author relies heavily on passive voice. I mean, I couldn't count how many times I read the word "was," even on just the first page, let alone the entire passage. It's a lot of authors don't even realize that they're using passive voice to start with when they start writing, but being able to recognize it in your own writing is one of the most important skills that you'll develop as a writer. So as you write, just try to recognize when you're using passive voice. And when you do recognize it, you'll be able to stop yourself, ask yourself how you can write it actively, and it will turn out better every time, and you'll just get better and better at recognizing it, so that your sentences and your paragraphs and your pages and your story ultimately will be an active one rather than a passive one.
I did have one other thing. And Ben,
also,
Kathryn, did you want to say something?
I'll wait for you.
Okay. There was one thing that I did want to look at that Ben can argue with me if he wants to. I felt like the violence level was pretty high for like a middle grade book, and I could be wrong, but like for contemporary middle grade, seeing a little kid like get kicked by an adult seemed too much for me. Am I wrong?
That is kind of a really gray area, at least in my opinion. If we ground this in a fantasy setting, I think it's a little bit less of an issue, because fantasy readers tend to
like violence,
like the violence a little bit more, and they're okay with it because the main character is going to be able to fight back.
Mm-hmm. That's what my issue was, because it was contemporary.
Yeah. And so I think this is another issue that I wanted to bring up, was that I didn't even know that this was like a power thing that went on with him. Like, as I was reading, I was confused whether it was an adrenaline rush that he experienced or whether it was some magical power thing that was going to be explained later on in the book. And I did not like that at all. If this is going to be a magical story with powers and things, I want to know from basically page 1 and not be dragged on for chapters waiting to figure out what it is. Like with Spider-Man, for example, and this might not be the best example because we all know Spider-Man, but we go in knowing that this is going to be a superhero movie, and so we're okay waiting until Spider-Man gets his powers to watch him have his powers and do fun things and stop bad guys. But if it were not Spider-Man, and it's just a story about a kid going to school who gets bitten by a radioactive spider and all of a sudden develops these spider abilities, when beforehand the only issue he had faced was whether or not his dad was going to be president, like those are two diametrically opposed conflicts and stories that are being told. So something needs to happen in this story to tell me from page 1, this is a world filled with people who have powers, or it's about to be, and that's going to drive a lot of the conflict.
Yeah, I thought I was reading a political thriller right up until the superpower showed up, and it was very jarring.
Yeah.
Kathryn, I think you wanted to say something else.
Sorry, it timed out for a second. Can I give a couple final thoughts?
Yeah.
Okay. fabulous points, and I agree with everything you guys just said. In general, I thought I had a hard time understanding his age. I didn't know if it was a middle grade or young adult because they never really said how old he was. And so that made me question a lot of his voice at times. Like, while some of the descriptions were really fascinating, like I thought, okay, why is he referring to like Flash Gordon and shrapnel and things like that? Because I didn't know him well enough before this big action scene took place. And I also hadn't seen him fail yet as a character before he was suddenly winning this attack in chapter 1. So I wanted actually to get more grounded into his real life more. And that can happen with the stuff Ben's talking about, with giving us a promise of that this is going to be a fantastical, adventurous, like superhero type story. But there's kind of like a general rule you can think about with grounding the character in their real world problems before the inciting incident. And that's thinking of them at home and at work and at play. And you can gauge that more with his age level and what that would mean to him. And it's not just getting told it, like, but getting shown, like, his family is like this. His mom is saying stuff like about kidnapping to him, actually in the scene, the dark sedans coming to his school, stuff like that. Because then we would understand him more and understand that he's a pudgy kid with all these issues when he does, like, the end of chapter 1 could be the end of the whole entire action scene has to end at chapter 1. And then in general, as far as prose goes, in addition to the passive voice issue, which Ben was talking about, there's tons of really long sentences. Like, almost every sentence is a really long sentence, which is probably, number one, a little bit difficult for a middle grade reader. And it also slows down the action, which a lot of this chapter is a high intense action scene. So be thinking about, reading how they're done. They're usually quick sentences when high action is happening, especially all that mystical stuff that starts happening. It's like all these really long descriptions, but really that would be happening so fast, and so it would be just really quick thoughts. They don't have to be necessarily beautifully written thoughts. And again, that goes to his voice. So those are my final thoughts. But in general, it was a really clean, it flowed really well. I thought it was, I liked it. So.
Me too. Thanks to this author for submitting, and thanks for your input, Kathryn and Ben. Thank you for coming on the show. I learned a lot, at least. So glad you guys were here. Our guest next episode will be New York Times bestseller Dan Wells, author of the I Am Not a Serial Killer series. If you'd like a first chapter critique from Dan, remember to check our submission guidelines and get us your first chapter by December 11th. We will be recording live on December 18th. Remember, this is both a video and a podcast, so you can either watch us on our YouTube channel, listen on Apple Podcasts, or whatever app you use. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review or a comment. It helps others to find the show. If you want to ask us questions or tell us we're awesome, you can find us on Twitter at Lit Service or on Facebook and Instagram at Lit Service Podcast. For Lit Service, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.